In this packet, we'll follow along in Flashman's footsteps, just to see how much ground our hero covered in his memoir, Flash for Freedom. When you look at some of the adventures Flashy has had, the sheer mileage can be exhausting. This was in a time before mass transport, where long sea voyages under sail and steam trains were the best that could be experienced. The time taken to cross the great distances only helped with the epic nature of the stories old General Flashman relayed to us. So I thought I'd try and bring some of this to life a little by using Google Earth and try to pick out all of the places Flashman visits, or perhaps mentions in Flash for Freedom. And there's quite a few stops along the way. So I should say the obligatory spoiler alert for all those who haven't read this packet. So let's get stuck in and kick off our first stop, the Flashman family home in London. Welcome to 13A Brook Street in the heart of Mayfair. A few hundred yards from the famous Claridge's Hotel, where the glass in the revolving front door is wiped down every 20 minutes to remove finger marks. Other famous residents on Brook Street include George Friedrich Handel, and right next door to him was Jimi Hendrix. Perhaps English heritage should think about blue plaques for fictional characters. Fenwick's department store now occupies number 13. It's 1848 and Flashman has just returned from Germany after he scraped with Lola Montez and Bismarck in Royal Flash. The next stop is Kennington Common. Flashy never actually visits here, but this is the scene of the 1848 Chartist demonstration, which has gripped the city with fear of revolution, and more importantly for Flashy, this also includes his father-in-law. Old Morrison blackmails Harry into taking up politics, which is the book's springboard into the soup for Flashman. The demonstration eventually loses momentum, with troops preventing access to the city's bridges. From here we make our way across the river to Trafalgar Square, where a gathering of Chartists are being lectured by a French agitator for being cowards. To this, a butcher's boy strips off his coat and fills in the Frenchie, after which he is carried off shoulder high to God Save the Queen.
Hooray! Hooray! Where have you been? Where haven't I been? Woof!
A couple of weeks later, we find Flashy is up to his old tricks with Haymarket tarts to help him settle in again to London life. Haymarket is a small walk from Brook Street. Now we're off to Wiltshire by way of a train to Devizes, which likely left Paddington Station, although Harry doesn't mention it, and then by coach to Scinde, where he visits the home of William Locke, who is playing host to some senior Tory politicians for the weekend that Harry has to find favour with. I may have stumbled on a mistake here by a Fraser, as Cleeve House didn't come into existence until 1857, 9 years after 1848. But I'm not going to dive too deeply here for plot holes. My whole YouTube channel is more hole than plot. Flashman then spends a day riding north of Salisbury Plain with Fanny Locke, who we meet later in a packet in Balaclava. After the events of the visit to Cleeve House, where Flashman nearly kills Bryant, Harry is taken to Poole, where he stays at the Admiral to await the arrival of John Charity Spring. From the Admiral, Harry is led by Spring to the jetty and into a boat where he crosses the channel to a port on the French coast. There's a few options here. It could be Brest, where at the end of the book Spring tells Flashman he is headed after Harry asks for passage out of New Orleans. But it's more likely to be the closer Cherbourg, or another French port on the channel, as they had made the crossing by nightfall. Here they board the Balliol College, with Flashman suffering so badly from seasickness he is helped up the ladder and falls to the deck, at which point a voice is heard to say, "Christ, it's Nelson!" From here the Balliol College races south into the Bay of Biscay, and along the African coast, passing Ivory Coast, Cape Palma, and then Wydar in the Kingdom Dahomey, now in modern-day Benin, where they put in. Here they pick up a local crew of crews who help them navigate the next stretch. They continue further east along the coast for 2 days and find their destination amongst the mangroves, a river mouth which they enter, where they find a jungle clearing which hosts the barracoons that hold slaves. Spring arranges to meet the King of Dahomey, King Gezo, at Apokoto, which is some miles upriver. Here Spring attempts to buy half a dozen Dahomey Amazons, and when the deal goes sour, they beat a hasty retreat, fighting along the way. They leave behind the Colt pistols Harry demonstrated and the cabin boy who was part of the deal. The butcher's bill had been 5 of the crew. After the cargo of slaves is loaded, the college strikes out westward into the Atlantic and then on to the Caribbean. They head for Isla de la Bahia, off of Honduras, where they anchor at Roatan. This being a major clearinghouse for the slave trade, they unload their cargo and Spring concludes the deals. After agreeing to ship some slaves to Havana, the college leaves Roatan and heads for the Yucatan Passage that divides Mexico and Cuba. As they progress, a US sloop appears from the southwest, which Spring begins to outrun, but this is joined by a brig from Cape San Antonio, Cuba, which forces Spring to clear for action and attempt to fight off the challenge. They lose the battle with Flashman persuading Looney, a screw-loose member of the crew, to act on his already deep fear of Spring to murder him. Harry is most proud of his powers of persuasion, as it only took 60 seconds. Spring is left sprawling on the deck, gunned down, which brings the action to a close, with the college surrendering. Harry is taken aboard the USS Cormorant, which leaves the scene, and days later arrives at Baltimore. Harry is taken the 40 miles by train to Washington, where he tells his cover story of being Cromer, an undercover anti-slavery spy for the British government. Eventually he is taken to the British ambassador's house, where he meets Abraham Lincoln, who sniffs him out as the scoundrel he is, but doesn't give the game away. It's decided that Harry must testify against Spring and the crew, and he is shipped aboard the USS Cormorant again to New Orleans. On arrival, the Cormorant anchors midstream in the big bend in the river off Customs House Levee. In the morning, Harry is rowed across the quay on the Algiers side, where unnoticed he melts away into the crowd to escape his navy escort. He walks about a quarter of a mile, where he finds a small boat to take him across the river to the north side and the levee nearest the Vieux Carré or French Quarter. Harry loves Orleans and puts it only behind London and Calcutta, and he explains New Orleans, of course, is where they civilised the French. Here he puts his plan of escape into action. It's the kind of thinking and resourcefulness that I admire in Harry. I won't go into detail here as I'll drift off topic again. He manages to clean himself up, do a wrong turn to Rudi von Starnberg, and posing as an Austrian aristocrat searching for his wayward sister, visits 5 knocking shops before finding an obliging Madame Susie Willenick. At 45 minutes, according to her grandfather clock, Flashy is proud to report that he had finished the capital act. Harry stays with Susie for 6 days. She arranges passage for him to Liverpool on a ship, the Anglesey Queen, leaving at night. He leaves the boarding house, but he doesn't make the ship. He is intercepted by unknown assailants who put a bag over his head and lead him on foot for 368 paces through the alleyways to a house of the Underground Railroad. Harry is blackmailed into helping the Underground Railroad run an important escaped slave, George Randolph, from New Orleans to Canada. He is to take a couple of slaves, including Randolph, via the steamboat Sultana to Cincinnati, where it will be passed on to another agent. They leave New Orleans and pass Gretna. The morning after, the Sultana runs aground on a mud bank at the Briaro Bend, not far below Natchez. Here Harry watches the famous Bixby refloat her again. It's at Natchez that Omer Hundrew, the slave dealer, boards the Sultana. The next day they land at Vicksburg and head on to Napoleon, but Harry won't make it. Harry and George do not hit it off, and the dislike turns to hatred as Harry considers George ungrateful and winds him up with the usual Flashman talent for getting under your skin. The situation comes to a head when Omer Hundrew recognises Randolph. Harry is faced with being accused of being a slave stealer and getting into custody, or making a run for it. It's not hard to guess that Harry dives from the moving steamboat into the river and makes for the shore on the Mississippi side. It's not exactly clear where this is, but it is somewhere north of Vicksburg. He heads inland due east for 3 days, sleeping rough before he decides to find work, and stumbles across a job as a slave driver on Mandeville's cotton plantation, Greystones. Again, Flashman isn't precise about the location, but it's about 50 miles from Helena. He spends a few months here until he is caught with his trousers down after a bout with Mandeville's wife. The punishment for his crime is that he is to be taken to another remote plantation in Alabama as a slave, where there is little chance of escape. He is thrown into a cart where he meets a slave girl, Cassie. After a day's travel, they hatch a plan for escape, where they overpower their captors and make for Memphis, which takes about 2 days. Here they put Cassie up for sale at the slave market, with the plan that she will run after the dark from her new master. She will meet Harry, and with the proceeds of the sale, they will join a steamboat, the New Missouri, to Louisville, on the Ohio River. They make their escape and spend a couple of days heading north until they realise in horror they joined the wrong steamboat and have continued on the Mississippi River at the Cairo Fork, heading for St. Louis, still well within the southern slave states. They find passage after 2 days on a steamboat called the Bostona, which will take them to Louisville from St. Louis and then on to Pittsburgh. They reach Cincinnati at breakfast the next day, which is where the captain announced due to the ice in the river he couldn't make Portsmouth this trip, and he would put in at Fisher's Landing before returning to Cincinnati. Fisher's Landing, according to Harry, was on the opposite side of the Ohio River to Portsmouth, but I can't find a record of this location, so I've guessed. The pair walk along the riverbank for an hour where they come to a small village almost opposite Portsmouth. I estimate this as South Portsmouth. Here they enter a tavern, as there are no ferries running, and after a while they are joined by a band of slave catchers. The leader of the band, Buck Robinson, suspects who they might be, and after a moment of pure Flashman where Harry seemingly abandons Cassie, they both make a run for it across the ice floe on the river. They make it across the river into Portsmouth, where they find Abraham Lincoln, who happens to be attending a meeting of abolitionists that very night. Lincoln and the townsfolk prevent Buck from taking them, and it's here a few days later that Cassie and Harry part company, with Cassie heading north to Canada, and Harry being delivered to a US Marshal to be delivered back to the US Navy. He travels by train to Columbus, and then on to Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and finally by ship to New Orleans. It's here Harry faces the trial he had worked so hard to avoid since his arrival in America and travelled so far to escape. The packet ends here in New Orleans. So there it is, Flashman's epic journey that takes him from deepest, darkest St James's to New Orleans. Phew, I'm exhausted just reading it. Did we miss any stops along the way? Why not add to the comments below? And if you like what we do here at Flashman's Study, why not hit that subscribe button to keep you up to date on the latest? And if this passed muster, how about a plucky thumbs up? Would you like nuts or cigars?